This video is going to demonstrate how we can take a list of data that has perhaps hundreds, maybe thousands or tens of thousands of records, and give the user the ability to filter that data set based on something like a region selection. But the trick is, instead of just filtering that list to every record that matches this region, we want to limit the viewing window to only 25 records at a time. Now, in order to move through the list, because the user could select a region that has thousands of entries, but we're only seeing 25 at a time, we're going to use a form control like this scroll bar and scroll through the resultant list. So as you can see at the top, the South region has 256 records. So when I scroll through this list, I want it to land on record 256 at the end of the scroll. But if the user were to select North, which has 488 records, I want to be able to end at 488 when I hit the bottom of the scroll. Likewise for East, there's only 104, so this list should go all the way from record 1 to record 104. To do this, we're going to use several different features in Excel in combination to create the desired result. Now, you may never have to create a scrolling list like this, but the features we'll use to produce this scrolling list, you'll be able to use those features in a lot of different other areas to solve different problems. In addition to learning all of the other features, we're going to see a really cool VBA trick that's going to allow you to overcome some of the limitations of form controls. I want to thank Alan Campbell, who's a viewer of the channel, for being the inspiration of this project. This is based on a question he had in a real-life scenario where he was having difficulty producing this type of list. So if you find this project interesting, make sure you post a thumbs up in the comments for Alan. Be sure to download these files from the link in the video description, because in here I have all of the documentation for everything we're going to do. So you can follow along while I do this, or you can just open up the solution file and reverse engineer it. Here are the main components we're going to use in this project. We'll be using some data validation to build our drop-down lists, some form controls for the scroll bar, a little VBA macro coding to control that scroll bar more effectively, and then a series of dynamic array functions like sort, unique, filter, drop, take, sequence, and choose columns. On the data sheet, we've got a standard table of transactional information, and this list goes all the way from row 1 all the way down to row 1001. So not including the header, we've got 1,000 transactions. Our first objective is to create a unique sorted list of regions which will be used to populate the data validation drop-down list. So I'm going to go over to cell H1, and we're going to write a formula that uses the unique function. The array of data that we're going to use is the region column of this table. When I hit enter, we get a unique list of regions. But what if you want that list to be in alphabetical order? Well, let's go back into the formula and wrap this unique function inside of a sort function. And now we have a sorted unique list. Now it's time to use that sorted unique list to feed a data validation dropdown. Let's go over to the output sheet, and we'll select cell C1. We'll go up to data, data validation, and for the data validation criteria, we will allow from a list. Now the source of this list, jumping back over to the data sheet, will be the first cell in the output of the sort unique function. Now, if we just select that cell, we're only going to get one word in our data validation. So we have to place at the end of this source entry a £, because this will tell data validation to use the entire spill range, which is the output of the sort unique function. Hit OK, and now when we hit the dropdown, we get a list of the sorted unique regions. And I'll go ahead and select North. Because we will be referring to cell C1 in some upcoming formulas, I'm going to click in the name box and give cell C1 a better name, like user region. The next thing we want to do is we want to repeat this header row from the source data into our output table. Now later on, we're going to build a list of sequence numbers. Those will go in column A, and that's going to get its own header. So the list of headings is going to start in cell B4. Now I could just retype the headings that I see here in this table, but if somebody changes the heading name, I want that heading name to update in the output. So we'll just create a reference formula to those headings. I'll type in an equals, go over to the data tab, and I'm going to click to the left of the header row, and that tells it to get the headers of the My Data table. Hit enter, and now we see those headings. Not only is it a time saver, but like I said, if they change the heading in the source table, you'll get that update in the output. Now let's zoom out a little bit here. We want to take the user's range choice from cell C1 and use that as a filter for this data table. Now ultimately, we only want to see 25 records at a time, but we'll start with just filtering the table and seeing all of the records. This formula is going to be placed in cell B5. So using a filter function, we'll say equals filter, the array of data that we're filtering, going back to the data sheet, I'm going to click the upper left corner of the table because that will select the entire My Data table, comma, the filter criteria is to examine the region field of the My Data table to see if the entry is equal to the user's region. This was the selection they made in cell C1. Enter. And since I selected North in C1, I'm looking at all of the North records. To test this, we'll change this to South. Now I'm looking at all the South records, the West records, the East records. In order to make it easy for the user to move through this data, let's give them a scrollbar form control to use. Similar to the scrollbar here, which scrolls through the entire sheet, this scrollbar form control is going to be limited to only scrolling a certain region of the sheet. To get to the form controls, we're going to go up to Developer. Now, if you don't have the Developer ribbon, because it's off by default, just right-click on any other tab name and choose Customize Ribbon. And in the Options window on the right, just check the box for Developer. Hit OK, and you'll have the Developer ribbon. In the Controls group, we're going to go to Insert. Now, there are two different sets of form controls, one of the more legacy controls and then the ActiveX controls. We're going to use a form control from the legacy group, and it's going to be this one right here called Scrollbar. So we'll give it a click, and then just draw basically a rectangle somewhere on the screen, and that will produce a scrollbar. Now, this scrollbar seems a bit on the meaty side, so this is where you're going to want to resize it and move it. And I'm going to put mine right about here. Now, the scrollbar doesn't do anything until you program it. The scrollbar needs to know what the lowest value would be when the scroll is at the top, the largest value when the scroll is at the bottom, how far each scroll increment will be when you click the up arrow and down arrow buttons, and then how far the increment will be when you're clicking inside the shaft of the scroll bar. So we're going to right-click on the scroll bar and go to Form Control. For current value, we're going to set this to 1. The minimum value will be 0. Now the maximum, we want this to be based on the item count of the selected region. Now you can't write a formula here to calculate that, but I'm going to show you later how we can use a really cool VBA trick to reprogram this feature on the fly. So for right now, we'll just give it a static 600. The incremental change will be 1, and the page count we're going to set to 25 because we want to look at 25 records at a time. And when I click the inner part of that scroll bar, I want to leap through the data in complete sets. Now there has to be some place to store the value of the current position of the scroll bar, and this is what the cell link is for. And this is going to be K2. We'll hit OK. And now let's test the controls. If I move the scroll bar handle all the way to the end, the scroll link value is 600. If I move it all the way to the beginning, the scroll link value is 0. If I click the inner part of the scroll bar, I leap through this in sets of 25, either forward or backwards. Our next step is to limit this list to only 25 records at a time. And we're going to use that by using a little mathematical trickery that incorporates the current position of the scroll bar. So I'm going to go ahead and set this all the way back to 0. Let's go back to cell B5. So here's our original filter control. And essentially what we want to do is discard n number of records from the beginning based on the scroll bar position. So if the scroll bar is set to 0, we don't want to discard any records. We're looking at the first record forward. But if I set the scroll bar to say 111, I want to discard the first 111 records and start my list at record 112. This way, when we move the scroll bar forward or backwards, it effectively starts our analysis at a deeper or shallower point in the data set. So scrolling back to the top, I'm going to click in front of the filter function, and we're going to wrap this in a drop function. So the array that the drop function is going to scan will be the result of the filter function. And then the number of rows we wish to drop is the value in cell K2. Close parentheses, enter. K2 currently says don't drop any records. But if I start moving forward in the scroll bar, it actually gives us the illusion of moving through the data. So if I scroll down to position 49, this would be the 49th row in the filtered data set based on the East region. Scrolling back to the top. Now we are discarding certain number of records at the beginning of the list, but we also want to discard certain number of records at the end of the list. So regardless of where we start in the list, I only want to see the first 25 entries. So we'll go all the way back up to cell B5, and we're going to wrap this drop filter function inside of a take function, because this will take a certain number of records from the beginning of the list. The array we're taking from is the result of the drop filter combination, comma, and the number of items we wish to take are 25 items. Close parentheses, enter, and now we're only looking at 25 items. When we scroll through the list, we're getting the effect we're going for. Now, it's not perfect because the scroll bar is set to a maximum of 600, and in this case, the East only has about 100 or so records, so once we hit the end of that, everything after that is blank. We want to figure out a way to have the scroll bar stop based on the count of the number of items in the total list. We'll achieve this by using a countifs function. So going up to cell C2, we want to count the number of items in the datasheet where the region matches the user's selection in C1. So let's start with a countifs function. The criteria will be the datasheet, and we're going to select the region column. And we want to count the number of rows in this table where the region matches the user region. This is what the user selected in cell C1 of the output sheet. We'll hit enter, and West has 152 entries. Now, to make sure that we're seeing the exact beginning and ends of the filtered data, one of the things I did, if we go back to the datasheet, is I created an instance of each selectable region, put that at the very beginning of the data, and set those sales values to $1 million. If we go to the end of the data, I created another complete set of regions, one of each, with the sales value set to $1. So if we filter any specific region, the first record we see in that list should be $1 million, and the last record we see should be $1. That way we know that we're seeing all of the records. We'll go back to output, and we can see that $1 million record for West, and if we scroll down to the bottom of the West transactions, there's the $1 record. But we're able to scroll past that because the maximum allowable range in the scroll bar is 600. So we need to limit this to the maximum number of records in the filtered list, which in this case is 152. So let's right-click on the scroll bar, Format Control, and change the maximum value to 152. Hit OK. Now when we scroll down, we can't go past the 152 point. But here's the problem, we're still going past the last record. The reason for that is if we scroll all the way back to the top, the maximum value isn't the maximum row, it's just the number of times you can click in the scroll bar. Well, if I'm looking at one record at a time and I limit myself to row 152, that's where it will stop. But if I'm looking at 25 records at a time, my first click, I'm already looking at the 26th record. My second click, I'm looking at the 27th record. So by the time I get down to the actual last record of the data, this is not the 152nd click. It's actually about the 127th click. So if I'm allowed to go all the way to 152, I'll end up scrolling all the way to the point to where the last record just leaves the screen. Now I've hit the end of the scrollable list. So we need to take this scroll bar and tell it that the maximum allowable point to scroll is 25 rows less than the total record count. Now if you right-click on the scroll bar and go to Format Control, we can't write a formula inside this max value entry. I'd have to go in here and manually type in 127, hit OK. Now we can see the very first record is 1 million, scroll all the way to the bottom, the very last record is $1. So the scroll bar is actually stopping prematurely to keep us from seeing those blank rows. If we change this region to something like North, which has 488 records, I can start with the first record, 1 million, but I can't go past the 127th scroll position. So I have to go back into this, Format Control, and then change this to be 488 less 25. Now this is not acceptable. So let's do a little form control trickery. We want to take whatever was calculated here in C2 and deduct 25 from it. Now I like to use named ranges, so I'm going to go to cell C2, and I'm going to give this cell a name of sales count. This way when I go to cell K5, the formula will be equals sales count minus 25. So the actual stopping point of the scroll bar should be, in this case, 463, not 488. If I go back and I change this to West, there are 152 records, but I want to stop at row 127. If I change it to East, there are 104 records, and I want to stop at row 79. Finally, South has 256 records, and I want to stop at 231. Going back to the scroll bar, right-click Format Control. Since we can't write a formula in this max value field to dynamically calculate the total number of records with that 25 row offset, I need to somehow get this max value to point to this cell K5. You can't say equals K5 in this entry and hit OK. It's an unacceptable use. So what we'll do is use a little Visual Basic coding, write a macro that will detect when the user selects a different region and then go grab that calculated value from K5 and load it into the max value property of this scroll bar form control. So to do this, I'm going to cancel. On the developer ribbon, let's go up in the upper left and click Visual Basic. In the Visual Basic editor, we're going to double click this Sheet 2 output entry. This will open up a blank code sheet that's dedicated to this specific sheet. In the file downloads, I've given you a text file that has all of the code created. So all we have to do is go here to this section called Output Sheet and highlight everything from private sub all the way down to end sub. We'll copy that, Control-C, go back into the Visual Basic Editor, and Control-V paste. This is a special type of macro called an event-driven macro. In other words, so instead of waiting for the user to launch the macro is launched automatically by some observable event like the change of a cell. So for this code, we're observing cell C1, and if the contents of C1 changes, we're going to go to the output sheet and change the max value property of the scroll bar. Now it's looking for the scroll bar by name, and in my code, I've got the scroll bar named output scroll bar. So we need to go back and give that scroll bar this specific name. So that way we'll go to the output sheet, find this scroll bar called output scroll bar, change the max value to whatever it sees on the output sheet in cell K5. So back over into regular Excel, to give this scroll bar a name, we have to go up to Home, and then under the Find and Select feature, we need to activate this thing called the Selection pane. This will give us a list of all of the objects on the sheet. Here we have a single object called Scrollbar 3. We're going to double-click that, and we're going to rename that to Output Scrollbar. Enter. If we right-click on the scrollbar and go to Format Control, currently the max value setting is set to 127. That's just what we hard-coded earlier. But if I were to go up to the region and change that to East, now let's right-click on the scroll bar and go to Format Control, and notice the max value is set to 79 because it took that value from cell K5. If I go back to the region and I change that to North, K5 has changed to 463, which is just 488 from the count, less 25. But let's right-click on the scroll bar, Format Control, and now the max value is 463. So even though you can't put a formula in this field, you can use VBA code to reprogram that field based on a formula that you put in a normal Excel sheet. All of these fields can be reprogrammed by doing a sideline calculation and then feeding it into the property by some sort of code. We'll hit OK. So scrolling to the top, in the north, there are 488 records. Here's our $1 million entry, the first record. Scrolling all the way to the bottom, there's the $1 entry. If I change this region to East, there are 104 entries. The first entry is $1 million at the top, at the very bottom, $1. But this scroll bar only moved 79 iterations. Changing this to South, there are 256 entries. There's our first entry, the $1 million record. Scrolling all the way down, 231 iterations, we stop at the $1 entry. There is another complication to this, and that is what happens if the user goes back to the data sheet and adds or removes records. Currently I'm set to South and it says there are 256 records, and the scroll is recalculating to row 231 for that 25 row offset. But if I go back to the data sheet and I'm going to insert a series of rows into this table, if I take South and repeat that for every inserted row, now going back to the output sheet, there are 268 records for South. The max is recalculating to 243, but because we didn't change regions, there's no reason for VBA to run that macro and reprogram the max field of the scroll bar. So the scroll max is recalculated to 243, but the max value is still set to the old 231. So we need to write a macro that changes the max value field not only when the user selects a new region, but also if rows are added or removed from the data source. Cancel this. We'll go back up to Developer, Visual Basic. So here was the code for detecting a change in cell C1 of the output sheet. Let's double-click on Sheet 1 Data Sheet, open its code sheet, and then in the file downloads, here is the code for the data sheet. This will detect any change on the sheet, like adding or removing rows, and then go to the output sheet and reprogram the output scroll bar's max field to whatever is on the output sheet's cell K5. So we'll highlight this code, everything from private sub all the way to end sub, copy it, Control-C, go to Sheet 1's data code sheet, and paste. We can close the Visual Basic Editor. If we go back to the data sheet and we were to delete these rows, go to the output sheet, there are 256 rows in South with an offset of 231. If we right-click on the scroll bar, Format Control, we can see that 231 is the max value. Now remember that number, 231. We go back to the data sheet, and I'm going to insert some rows into this table, make them all part of South. Going back to output, there are now 267 entries for South with a calculated offset of 242. Remember that used to be 231. Right-click on the scroll bar, Format Control, it's now 242. Go back to Data, highlight those rows and delete them. Go back to output. Now there are 256 rows for south with an offset of 231. Right-click on the scroll bar format control, and the max value is 231. So we now have code that will detect when the user selects a new entry. Scrolling down, last record is $1. But also if the user goes in and adds or removes any rows from the data source. Our final touch for this report is to have a list of updating sequence numbers here on the left. So even though these records are coming from a variety of different rows in the table, I want them to look like a single new list. This way, when I scroll all the way to the top, this is the first record, second record, third record, fourth record, etc. So to start with, we'll go into the heading cell, and I'm just going to type in a # for the heading. Now to generate a list of updated sequence numbers, we'll use the sequence function. So we'll say equals sequence. The number of items that we want to create across these rows will be 25 items, comma, we only want one column of numbers, and we want that number to start at whatever value K2 is. Now, if we're at the very beginning of the list, K2 is set to 0, but we want the sequence number to be 1, so we'll add 1 to that, comma, and we want every number in the list to be incremented by a value of 1. Hit enter, and now we have a list of 1 to 25. So K2 is set to 0, the list starts at 1, it counts to 25. If I move my scroll bar through this list, if I have moved 180 steps through my scroll bar, that means I'm on the 181st record. My sequence list starts at 181 and goes all the way to 205. Scrolling all the way to the bottom, there's that $1 record. Remember how north had 480 entries in it? We are on the 480th entry. If I change this to, say, south, there are 256 records. The last record is the $1 entry, and it's sequence number 256. East has 104 records. There's the $1 entry, that's the last record, and then we see 104. So in the real world, you'll want to hide these calculations in column K, maybe put them someplace far to the right of the sheet where the user will never see them, or put them on a hidden sheet. Just make sure you update the VBA code to match the location you move them. Now here's something else that I would do if this was a real scenario. Looking through this list, I have pulled every column from the original data source. Well, one of those columns is the region column. When I select a region from the dropdown like South, everything in this column is going to say South. Now, if you want to see that for verification purposes, that's fine. But if you trust that the formula is delivering you only the South records, there's really no need to have to see this column. So let's update our formula so that when the user selects a specific region, it brings back all of these rows, but it does not bring back the region column, because that's already understood. Here I've created a new version of the start point, where I've removed everything that has nothing to do with the problem we're trying to solve. So before, when I wanted to create a list of dynamic headings that came from that other data source, we used this formula that extracted the header row from the MyData data source. And when we hit enter, we got all of the headings from that source. But I don't want the region column. So what we'll do is we'll go back in here and we'll wrap this function inside of a choose columns function. So we're pulling the entire header row, but then we're going to only choose certain columns from that pull. So looking back at the data sheet, we only want the first, the third, the fourth, and the fifth columns. So in curly braces, I'm going to type in 1, 3, 4, 5, close curly brace, because this provides a list of columns to the choose columns function. We'll hit enter, and now I get the first, third, fourth, and fifth header. Same thing for the filtered list. Originally, we were pulling all columns, all rows of the selected region. But let's take the result of this filter function and run it through a choose column so we only choose certain columns from the filtered table. So right before the word filter, we'll put a choose columns function. So the array that choose columns is analyzing is the output of filter, but then we give it the list of columns that we want to pull from that filtered list. So this is going to be that same curly brace, 1, 3, 4, 5 list. Close parentheses, comma, and hit enter. So when the user chooses east, we don't have to look at all of the entries that say east because we know it's coming from the east. If I were to change this to, say, north, these are all of the north entries. So here's the finished project. The user comes in, selects their region. We get a filtered list for only that region without showing the actual region name again. And we have a scroll bar that begins with the very first record and goes all the way down to the very last record. Remember to download this file from the link in the video description. This way you have access to all of the formulas I've created, plus all of the notes, including the code that you need to copy-paste into the Visual Basic Editor. You might not ever need to build this specific solution, but the tricks and tools you've seen in this video can be used in an unlimited number of scenarios. Let me know in the comments what your favorite feature was, or if you learned something here that you didn't know before. Thank you for watching, and remember, at BCTI, the learning never stops.